Well, to use a part of Junot Diaz title, wow. This is great. Thank you and welcome all of you, students, colleagues, family, friends, and that includes, of course, nuestro amigo Junot Díaz, our distinguished visitor. Before we get to hear him, though, I must give special thanks to a few people who are of great importance for today's event. Judy Young and the Distinguished Visitors Office, Donna Rain and the group from Center for Peace and Global Citizenship, also the Alliance of Latin American Students. Muchas gracias, chicos. Sara, ustedes. Whole building office managers, Krista Murphy and Gail Heimberger, helped tremendously. And our whole department in the Spanish department, Graciela, Roberto, Ana, Aurelia, Israel in absentia. It's great that the help from all of you made it happen, and of course my students from Spanish 242 representing Nueva York.
Oh, sure. Professor, you have to introduce yourself. You haven't even said your own name.
Asim Asad, para servirles. It is indeed an honor to have Junot Díaz with us after recently winning 2 awards. In early March, the National Book Critics Award, and just a few days ago, the Pulitzer Prize. So it is even more so meaningful that you've made it in spite of your busy schedule. We're all very aware of that. So please join me in turning off the cell phones, right? Look, it's turning off, and giving the warmest welcome to Junot Díaz, who will share with us his whispers from the new America.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. They have me mic'd, so I don't actually have to stand in front of this, for real. No, I don't. Hi, young people. I wanted to thank the college for having me. Yeah. I wanted to thank the various departments and organizations and faculty members who, no doubt, busted their asses to make this sort of happen. Yeah, I'm sure some of these very faculty members got a good portion of the young people in this damn audience. They're like, show the fuck up. So, you know how these things are. Voluntary or involuntary, we'll try to make good use of it. Yeah, I do the same shit to my students. The arts are that way. Yeah. Finally, in either event, I wanted to thank you all for coming out and sharing a couple of hours in sort of an arts event. It's kind of an almost endangered tradition. The arts, sort of people getting collectively to think and talk about the arts is, it's, doesn't happen often. So I really appreciate, again, no matter what the motivation, all of your presence here. It's sort of important, not even as an individual, but just because I don't think as a society we do this as much as we should. So it's good to see anywhere at any time. Yeah. And of course, I wanted to thank our beloved faculty member, Professor Asima, because if you want to talk about busting your hump, she made sure not only that she got through rush hour traffic como una maldita loca, so we get here at 6 o'clock, but she stayed on top of me all these months and made sure not only that I would agree to come, but that I would actually show the fuck up. Not because as an artist or a writer you're even remotely interesting or special, but because I'm so bad at answering emails and like remembering stuff. But so every 2 days she would remind me. She's like, 27 days to the reading. I was like, oh shit. That's organized, Joe. Yeah, that's really organized. And you know, part of it is you should remember us sort of weird speakers and presenters and artists, we just kind of materialize here, yeah? And we do our little song and fucking dance, and then we all go off and do whatever fuck we do at night. But you've got to remember that most of this comes because someone tends to take up and give up an enormous amount of time to make it happen. Yeah, you almost never see that work. You see the clown, but you never see the people actually building the circus in a way. You know, clearly some young people had to do with this. So I appreciate all the sacrifice and work all of you have done. So that's about as many thank yous as you can fit in 5 minutes, yeah? All right. So this is a Quaker school, is this true? Yes. Oh, the friends. Yeah. Oh, shit. And they're all, you guys look so incredibly healthy and robust, too. For real. No matter... It is kind of strange. I teach at a school where people look like, oh, look at the chuckle patch. They look a little less healthy, a little less, so it's nice to see, yeah? I thought we would make this swift. Let's lay this out, yeah? I'm going to read a little bit, and then I thought we would have a discussion. You could ask some questions. I'll try to answer them as best as you can, as best as I can. And then we'll finish off with me reading a little bit more. And then afterwards, any of y'all who want, you know, to flee, be my fucking guest. You know, if you need to ask me anything that you didn't want to ask because it was public, you feel free to kind of give me the bum rush, okay? So let's do it that way. All right. Guys, how are you doing? Spring is here, yeah? Oh, where are the seniors, first of all? Oh, amongst the happiest of human beings. Yeah? God damn. Where are you going when you finish here, madame?
We'll be working in Philadelphia as a paralegal.
Oh, you're straight. Yeah. Oh, that's dope. Okay. That's cool. And I guess I have to, I always ask this out of my kind of nationalist, tribalist curiosity. I was wondering how many Latinos are present? Damn, that's a grip. So it's either you all came out or the school has a lot. So which is it? Say again? Mi amor, say again?
We all came out.
Oh shit.
We're in little pockets, but we came out.
This only happens when there's like a party, right? Okay. And how about people from the Caribbean? Hi, my beloved Caribbean, and Dominicans, of course. You notice the reduction. Yeah. Now I'm going to get slightly more particular. How about people from Aswa? Is there anybody from Aswa here? Shit. That's where my family's from. Yeah, it's the only desert in the Caribbean. Well, no, it's true. It's not a joke. It's actually the only desert in the Caribbean. So it's an interesting place because anyone who's familiar with desert cultures knows that deserts kind of produce similar tones in people. So people from Aswa are rather peculiar, constructed from an incredibly harsh environment. So I wanted to see if anybody was from this place. Yeah. Okay. Once again, Mom, I am alone. So I'm going to just read something quick again, and then we'll take some questions. I'm sure your faculty. Did your faculty tell you have to ask questions, or no? They didn't do that. They did do that. Did they say at least like 5? Yeah, I fuck with my students. I'm always like, I take the attendance sheet and the 5 worst attendees, kids. I'm like, no one else has to ask a question. You guys have to do it for the whole time. And that's it. They're like, oh, die, professor. All right, here goes. You don't have to know much about this. It's second person. New Jersey, yeah. The you in this case, as you know, the second person is a 14-year-old Dominican girl. Her name is Lola, and this is kind of about her and her mother. This is 1982, and the section is just called Wildwood, 1982. And it goes like this. It's never, Wildwood, 1982. It's never the changes we want that change everything. This is how it all starts, with your mother calling you into the bathroom. You will remember what you were doing at that precise moment for the rest of your life. You were reading Watership Down, and the rabbits were making their dash for the boat, and you did not want to stop reading. But then your mother called again, louder, her "I am not fucking around" voice, and you mumbled irritably, "Si, señora." She was standing in front of the medicine cabinet mirror, naked from the waist up, her bra slung around her like a torn sail, the scar on her back as vast and inconsolable as a sea. You want to return to your book to pretend that you had not heard her, but it is too late. Her eyes meet yours, the same big smoky eyes that you will have in the future. "Ven acá," she commands. Your mother is frowning at something on one of her breasts. For the record, your mother's breasts are immensities, one of the wonders of the world. The only ones that you've seen that are bigger are in nudie magazines and on really, really fat ladies, yeah? They're 35 triple Ds, and the areolas are as big as saucers and as black as pitch. And at their edges are fierce little hairs that sometimes your mother plucks and sometimes she does not. These breasts have always embarrassed you, and when you walk in public with her, you are always conscious of them. After her face and her hair, her chest is what she is most proud of. Your father, your mother likes to brag, could never get enough of these, but given the fact that he ran off on her after the third year in marriage, it seemed in the end that he could, yeah? You dread conversations with your mother, those one-side dressing downs. You figured that she has called you into the bathroom to give you another earful about your diet. Your mother's convinced that if you eat more plátanos, you will suddenly acquire her same extraordinary, train-wrecking, secondary sex characteristics. Even at that age, you were nothing if not your mother's daughter. You were 12 years old and already as tall as she was, a long, slender-necked ibis of a girl. You had her green eyes, clearer though, and her straight hair, which makes you look more Hindu than Dominican, and the behind that the boys have not been able to stop talking about since the 5th grade, but whose appeal you do not yet understand. You have her complexion too, which means that you are dark. But for all of your similarities, the tides of inheritance have yet to reach your chest. You have only the slightest hint of breast. From most angles, you are flat as a board. And you are thinking that your mother is going to order you to stop wearing bras again because, in her words, they are suffocating your potential breasts, discouraging them from developing, yeah? You are ready to argue with your mother to the death because you are as possessive of your bras as you are of the pads that you can now buy yourself. But no, your mother does not say a word about eating more plátanos. Instead, she takes your right hand and guides you. Your mother is rough in all things, but this time she is gentle. You did not think her capable of it. Do you feel that? She asks you. At first, all you feel is the heat of her and the density of the tissue, like a bread that has never stopped rising. She needs your fingers into her. You're as close as the two have ever been, and your breathing is what you will remember. Don't you feel that? She says. She turns towards you. Coño, muchacha del diablo, stop looking at me and feel. So you close your eyes, and your fingers are pushing down, And you are thinking, of course, of Helen Keller and how, when you were a little girl, you wanted to be just like Helen Keller, except a little more nunnish, yeah? And then suddenly, without warning, you do feel something. A knot just beneath the skin, tight and secretive as a plot. And at that moment, for reasons you will never quite understand, you are overcome by the feeling, the premonition, that something in your life is about to change. You become lightheaded, and you can feel a throbbing in your blood, a beat, a drum. Bright lights zoom through you like photon torpedoes, like comets. You do not know why or how you know this thing, but that you know it cannot be doubted. It is exhilarating. For as long as you have been alive, you have had bruja ways. Even your mother will begrudge you that much. Hija de Liborio, she called you after you picked your Diaz winning lottery number for her. And you assumed that Liborio was a relative. That was before Santo Domingo, before you knew about the great power of God. I feel it, you say. Lo siento. And like that, everything changes. Before the winter is out, the doctors remove the breast that you were needing, along with the axillary lymph node. Because of the operation, your mother will have trouble lifting her arm over her head for the rest of her life. Her hair begins to fall out, and one day she pulls it all out herself and puts what's left inside of a plastic bag. You change too, not right away, but it happens. And it is in that bathroom where it all begins, where you begin. Thank you. So, seven, 8 minutes of reading about the upper limit of human tolerance. Yeah? So why don't we take some questions, and I will read again at the end. Oh, young sir.
We talked a bit about this in class, about how, like, during these really intense moments where the mother finds out she has cancer, we see the scar on her back, yet there's these very hilarious moments, as you're reading, everyone's laughing. And I commented, this is just how, when I was reading it, I would be laughing, and then I'd feel uncomfortable because I was laughing. Or either I would, see it as like a little light shining through in this, dark, time. I was wondering, were you, really shooting for a specific, reaction from the reader when you decided to add humor within these intense moments?
No, it's a really good question. I mean, again, part of the problem with this book for me, at least its construction, was that I was dedicated from the beginning to this bizarre kind of book that would sort of, kind of live up to a lot of these ideas I have about simultaneity, One thing about being Caribbean is like you're kind of obsessed with the concept of simultaneity, even if you don't know what the fuck it means. Yeah? What's really strange about it is that I wanted to create a book that would be, in my mind, whether people agreed or not, you have no control over that. How a readership interacts with a book, in the end, it becomes the person's book once they read it. The decision not to read it is as much theirs as the decision to read it. But before that, my idea was, could I create a book that was, in my mind, equally horrifying and brutal and cruel and like terrifying, and equally parts kind of like joyful, hilarious, playful, and alive. I mean, of course, there were plenty of other aspects emotionally, but I wanted to be able to sustain both notes simultaneous without one sort of trumping the other. The problem is, if it was slightly funnier than it was cruel, it would become a little bit too comedic. If it was a little bit crueler than it was funnier, then I felt in my mind that the book, the complexion of the book would begin to coarsen a little bit. And so the idea for me was, by creating this kind of what I thought was an ultimate hybrid, where I wanted the balance to be in some ways perfect. Yeah, though there is no perfection, you know what I mean? Just in my mind, I thought it was acceptable. I felt that that would be a good way of sort of describing in my mind what the world is, where the world seems very uninterested in our categories. I mean, the best way to get a sense of humans trying to mediate their encounter with the world is to read TV Guide. Yeah? I fucking love TV Guide, guys. It's like some of the best writing you'll ever see. Because people have to portray like movies and TV shows in like 6 words. You know? In TV Guide, all reality is divided in between like comedy, drama, romance. It's easier to separate the world into genres. But what you quickly discover is the world has no ability to obey our genres. So you could be at a funeral of someone you care about deeply, and somebody could actually make a joke that makes you laugh. Yeah? Where if you watch a movie and it's supposed to be a drama, there are rarely any yucks in it. You know, if it's like the sad mom caught cancer movie, rarely are there really good jokes. You know? But life is too complicated for those sort of limited formulas. And I thought by doing that, I would be able to kind of create a shorthand approximation of how I felt life was lived, that people don't seem to obey, and life doesn't seem to obey any of these kind of classifications. And it's a good way to keep readers kind of like off their feet a little, which is also something life loves to do. Another question? Sir, you have an orange shirt, and then directly behind you. You first, sir, okay. And then directly behind you.
So this might be obvious if one has read the book, which I haven't, but I'll ask. Risk of embarrassing myself. Why the second person?
Yeah, no, it's not obvious, I think, even for someone who read the book. In fact, it's kind of like a William Gass, that almost impenetrable American writer. He once described one of the process of writing books is that often as writers we'll use certain strategies to help construct and organize our book, but these strategies don't necessarily have much significance beyond that they help us put the book together. And in this case, what mattered for me, the second person, was that the rest of this chapter is told in a first-person voice from the young sister. The second person at the beginning of that chapter, I was hoping would signal to either a very bored grad student or an extremely perceptive, reader, that the very fact that it's opening in the second person is a warning that even the first person that follows is basically mediated. That the voice of that young woman is being mediated through a narrator who's kind of, the one who's saying the you is the person who's actually telling that. And that's a way to signal it. I don't know, did you ever read Handmaid's Tale? Yeah? Handmaid's Tale is a fucking great book, man. You ain't never read Handmaid's Tale? Oh, shit. Yeah, go check out Handmaid's Tale because it answers that question better than I could. Handmaid's Tale purports to be the story of a woman who survives this kind of like anti-woman apocalypse. But at the end of the book, what you discovered is that even though her voice is like I, what you discover is that the entire book is being mediated by a male editor. And that's revealed at the end of the book. In this case, I flipped it and revealed the mediation at the beginning. Because I think it's important to signal that none of the voices in this book are coming directly from the people. The entire book is mediated by a narrative persona. And there's reasons for that. But again, it's like not much of an answer, right? Yeah.
The narrative persona is you, or is it within the book?
Oh, no. Dude, I couldn't write a book like this. Sorry. It's no, your narrative persona is a constructed self. It's an apparatus, yeah? I mean, look, all of y'all go to parties, And you got your party persona, who's often like nicer and cooler and cuter than who you really are. Yeah? Well, what happens is, imagine that you have to construct a party persona, but it's a narrative persona. It's a make-believe person who's the narrator. In this case, his name is Yunior. And Yunior is like 10 times smarter than me because writing smart is easy, right? Name all the 50 states in alphabetical order. I can't fucking do it, but I can write Yunior knowing that, because I can just get on Wikipedia and be like, you know, so Yunior's smarter. He's certainly a lot braver and a lot more compellingly weak than anything I could be. Sir? Oh, Diablo, Papa, what's up, bro? Oh shit, son.
Proud. I got here late when you got
Oh, don't worry, bro.
winning the Pulitzer, man. That's extremely just powerful.
This is a friend, an old friend. He works up the road at Swarthmore.
Knowing how long you worked on this book, and when I finally got to read it, the characters, the Latino characters and their relationships with other people are so compelling. The Puerto Rican godwoman, Lola Oscar Jr., who is like a player but with a conscience, but that he's doing wrong. But the section you just read is a prelude to what I think is one of the more powerful sections, where you have Lola talking to her homeboys about when her mother got cancer. This was her chance to like get away, and it kind of goes against this kind of whole loving, nurturing, stereotypical mother-daughter relationship. And she's explaining herself like, look, if you don't know, then you don't understand, so don't judge. She talks about being the perfect Dominican slave, and about her mother being the type of mother that will squash you if you let her. And that was extremely powerful. So if you can talk about the constructions of these very complex characters, especially, I guess, that passage that you referred, Lola talking about she's trying to be out while her mother is basically weak. There's a lot in there, but I was really moved by that following passage that follows from what you just read.
Yeah, no, thank you, sir. That was very, persuasively put. I think that what's fascinating is any of us, look, being Dominican, that's what I know. Yeah? Being Dominican from New Jersey, that's really what I know. Being Dominican from New Jersey, arriving from Santo Domingo in 1974, you keep narrowing, it becomes very particular, yeah? But I guess I always assumed if people come from very close families, you discover that families, they have really, there's good reasons why close families are useful for people to live in a world like ours, but there's also tremendous dangers, yeah? And that one of the things about families is families are perfect vehicles to transmit unspoken history. I mean, in some ways, that's what families do best, beyond just protecting people and providing sort of, kind of a framework for young people to survive. Families are really dope at transmitting shit that you don't even know that you're getting. And what I thought was interesting is that when you're a teenager, you don't know this shit. You're just kind of like wrestling with your parents, if you're that kind of person. What I felt was important about when I was growing up is I thought I was wrestling with my mom and my dad. But what I was really wrestling was with my mom and my dad, plus me, plus whatever hormonal craziness was jamming into my head, plus a lot of the unspoken shit that was between us and all around us that we may not even each of us have known, but we were playing it out, And I was kind of obsessed. I had two sisters. One sister was 2 years older. The other sister was a year younger. And my mom was this really wonderful person. She always provided for the family, would sacrifice her life to make sure we eat and we could have an education. But my mother, while she let me and my brothers run around the streets like crazy, I could literally come home, my clothes all ripped, and a bazooka. Welcome home, But my sisters, my mom had, and I used to joke around, Dominican Purda. My sisters were going nowhere. And that's not every Dominican girl, clearly. But my mom had this crazy lockdown. And my sisters, in some ways, from my experience, and you don't want to generalize to anyone else, but for my sisters, the road in some ways to themselves was through mom. Like, in some ways, they had to actually defeat my mother in some way to be able to become full selves and to be able to find the kind of agency that one requires to be an adult. And it was a fascinating struggle because it's the person that in some ways you love and the person who nurtures you, but it's also the person who's passing on a lot of fucked up shit and who in some ways is the one who's locking that fucking door. You know, and I was fascinated by that dynamic. And I saw my sisters go through it. And as a dude, I had no fucking sympathy as a teenager. I would pursue my privilege the way we all pursue our privileges, without thinking, automatically, and with tremendous callousness. Yeah, that's what privilege is about. You don't even know you're eating it up, but man, you want doubles. It was only when I was older and I realized that, like, the cost to my sister and my mom, that battle. And I was fascinated by that, you know? And just the thought that, like, even though my mother was sort of locking my sisters in the house, my mother depended deeply on my sister's knowledge of the United States to survive. Even though my mom was trying to reinforce that my sisters were dependent, like, you're in the house, you don't go nowhere. In fact, my sisters sort of mothered my mom. Because when it came to English, when it came to the United States, she was a child, if you think about it. She didn't know how to sort of negotiate. And I sometimes wonder if that powerlessness didn't make her perform supra-motherness more. You know, that the fact that whenever she walked out the door, she was like, really, she had to depend on my sister. So when she came home, she became like triple mom. And these are things that happen to a lot of families, I think. You know, I mean, not all of them, clearly. But I just felt like, why not? You know, if some kind of half-addled Scottish king could be the source of, like, universal dramaturgical knowledge, why couldn't some crazy Dominican family in Patterson be the source? You know, it's equally as bizarre. What the fuck do y'all know about the Scottish kings, yo? I mean, it's really weird. Or what do you know about whalers? You know, some of the fundamental texts of America are like Moby Dick. Whaling is as weird as being Dominican. So I was like, if whaling can be the center of our literary universe, Alpaca Domos and Patterson, I was like, this seems pretty cool, you know. So I mean, there was a lot of that. I didn't address fully your question because I felt your question was far more sincere and deeply understood than my answer because, you know, I have to contextualize my answer, but I felt like your question was better than the answer and provided us with more information in some ways. Some other questions, please? Madame?
Well, my first question is tripping over my second one now. But when you start talking about the dynamic with the mother and the sisters, I was wondering about whether you see any kind of connection there with immigration. And because I was connecting with it as a child of people who are migrants, not immigrants, but migrants, with the powerlessness of the parent in a new kind of cultural space, depending on kids who are more fluent in that space. And I just wondered if you make any connection.
Well, of course.
With that at all.
I mean, Jesus, if you grew up in Jersey, it's like I grew up in Jersey and like half of the people I grew up with were African American. And about 80% of them were either from North Carolina or Alabama. You know, you think you grow up in Jersey and black folk are going to be like deracinated, but most all of them are internal migrants, you know? And yeah, man, I think that's a big, big deal. Dudes, I always think that the more that you depend on the group, the more likely you are to act out against that group. Dependency really leads to really bad behavior, which is, you know, I mean, you don't want to make too big of a point of it because what the earlier comment was talking about is that even though these things have larger cultural, sociological, and political impact, we are really talking about people. And what's interesting about Lola and her mother is that, sure, they represent certain larger things, but they're examples of really discrete people. You know, the way Lola wants to run away from home is very unique. You know, the way her mother reacts to her is sort of individual. Yeah? So I sort of not to stress the point, I both embrace the commonality, but also want to like reinforce that the gift of art is that it makes a very particular argument that can be useful for larger connections as long as it doesn't erase the particularity of it. Yeah, yeah. There were hands in the back. I think we'll start with you, madame, and then we'll move that way.
I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about your writing process and specifically how you keep voice consistent, because I know Yunior is a figure that you've used in different works. Did you use a lot of precision? Do you test with friends? Are you reading out loud a lot? Like, how do you keep that language true, as you say, to the specificity of these characters?
Sure. I mean, the question of voice is very important. Of course, you're constantly going over it. I mean, I love reading. I'm like one of those big time, I love reading more than I love writing by a huge gap. And one of my favorite things is books I love where halfway through a character's name changes and the publisher still hasn't corrected it. You know, where the character says, "Oh, I miss Mindy," when in chapter 1 the person who died was Juanita. You know? It's a piece of art. You're definitely doing an enormous amount of work to maintain internal cohesion. Whether it's just the cohesion at the level of information or it's cohesion in matters of voice and consistency. So yeah, I'm one of those like 30, 40, 50 rewrite people. It's easy to say and to hear, but if you ever come by my apartment and see what the amount of papers I generate just for 10 pages, you know, some people I think can do this sort of thing. Some people can do this sort of thing unconsciously. I think for me, it requires a lot of work. But you know, on top of that, there's a lot of work that you need to do for the tale, and the tale is the voices, the characters, believability, and there's a lot of work you have to do for the telling. What's the structure? What are the strategies that you use to convey this information, the tale? And yeah, you end up doing a ton of rewriting. This was a book that I felt lived or died if a reader would be willing to make some of the large leaps. Because very much in my mind, the way the Caribbean is, this series of historical fragments or this series of geographical fragments, I wanted this book to be desperately marked more by its gaps than by its presences. And I needed people to be able to follow through with some momentum, but still understand that this story has tremendous silences inside. You had his hand, sir.
Yeah, I was curious if you could tell us a little bit about, just from the personal side, how you found out that you wanted the Pulitzer Prize, and also what sort of impact does that have now on how you're going to write in the future? Do you feel any pressure on you, and why do you feel pressure?
Gee whiz. Yeah, I think that's probably the least nerdy answer I'll have. Yeah, I was visiting my mother. My mom lives in Jersey still. Yeah, she lives in Ridgefield Park, right across from George Washington Bridge. And she was leaving for Santo Domingo. Her and her 2 sisters go for 3 months at a time to take care of my grandmother. And so it was my mother's turn, and it was the night before she left, the day before she left, and she was packing. I brought her a bunch of stuff that she needed. And I was playing with my nephew. His name's Daniel, right? And he's 2 years old. And I don't know about anyone else, but with this prize, I wasn't called ahead of time. They're not like, "Oh, just so you know." I found out because they announced it at a news conference, at a press conference. And somebody called up a friend of mine to be like, "Oh, this dude won this prize. I know you know him. What do you think about that?" And she was like, "Doot, doot, doot, doot." And she's like, "Yo, I think you may have win a fucking prize, dude." And so I couldn't hear her. Because of my little nephew was mad loud. And I was just like, "Listen, I'll call you back." And no, I'm not kidding. I went outside. My mom lives right at the edge of the Hackensack River. And I went over and just stood over the Hackensack River and called back. And my friend was like, "Dude, I think you may have won the fucking prize, yo." And I was like, "Are you sure?" She's like, "Nope." You know? So I just waited. I waited for 20 minutes on that bridge for the names to show up on the New York Times webpage. She was there, refreshing. And it was actually the writer, a good dear friend of mine, a very famous writer, the Haitian writer Edwige Danticat. You know, So, that was that. And as far as pressure or anything, I mean, I can't say this enough. I always think that the idea that anything from the outside could create more pressure than I put on myself, it's kind of a funny idea, a funny possibility. And I say this because most people never met my father. Yeah? Well, no, I mean, my old man was, as we say in Santo Domingo, él fue militar. He was extremely disciplinarian, a very brutal, intolerant, not at all compassionate man who thought of as mistakes of being a moral judgment on you. So that if you made an error or you made a miscalculation, or if something just happened within your vicinity, there was no sense that causality was random. For real, like if something just fell down, the person nearest to it had to take responsibility for it, like straight the fuck up. And it was a brutal regime to live under. I mean, jokes aside and everything, I know that when I think of all the things I went through in my life, like working in steel mills, delivering pool tables full-time to get through college, I still think that that kind of incredible, intolerant, surveillance, pressure, judgment, that screwed me up more than anything. And so when I start working, I begin already, I feel like 12 miles under the sea with that much pressure, And I mean, this prize, I'm sorry, this prize, if it was this prize versus my dad would slap that shit out in 2 seconds. When we're talking psychically, the kind of pressure, yeah? And I feel like, again, one would have to be anointed Jesus Christ before my dad would be like, okay, you're all right. So I don't think it's going to change much. My next book, I'm hoping my next book will be, I keep calling it this because it helps me. I'm hoping, that anime and manga, Akira. Yeah, my next book is like Dominican Akira. It's like Dominicans 100 years in the future. And they're all like psychic terrorists. So it's a guarantee the Pulitzer hasn't made me strategic about my career. Come on, we'll take a few more questions. We'll have to come down since we're focusing. Madame.
So you've worked in the short fiction form and in the novel form, and I was just wondering what you prefer about the short fiction process versus the novel form.
Yeah, I'm not, guys, I find writing to be very difficult. Most writers I know are very happy with the process. They might complain a lot, but they're happy enough to do it every goddamn day. I find myself the process to be extremely difficult. A friend of mine keeps saying, he's like, wow, you have talent in something you're completely dubious and suspicious of, which is tend not to be the case. Most of us, it's not a good idea to be dubious and suspicious of the one praxis that you have any facility with. But given that context, I hope never to write another short story. And I don't mean that as an empty sort of, that's not a blandishment. I find the short story form incredibly difficult. We live in a country with perhaps the greatest living short story writers, with one of the most astonishingly impressive short story tradition. To actually write a good short story in the United States that stands out is sort of like, it's like being really good at baseball in Santo Domingo. It's you gotta bring it in ways that and it's a gem cutter's craft. It's extraordinarily precise. One sentence, one stray emotion, one distraction can throw you off. Whereas a novel's very size and its very attempt to embrace the sloppiness of life is more forgiving. Now, I don't find either form easy, but I find that the short story form nerve-wracking, because the whole context for me of writing a short story is that I'm not going to do it if I don't think it's going to be good enough to hang out with the rest of these bad boys. And that's tough, man. Whereas a novel, these days, dudes, if your novel is half good, you're in. You know, but short story is tremendous, tremendous, tremendous. You know? Yeah. So we'll work our way. Let me see, what area hasn't been called on much? Is this area, madame? And then we'll move by.
I'm interested in your use of science fiction in Oscar Wilde, and especially something that was really interesting was the comparisons between Tolkien and the Trujillo regime. And I thought that was really interesting because this parallel between totalitarianism and science fiction, both of them were creating a world, I guess, with its own internal order and rules. And I was just wondering if you could maybe generalize that to writing or in general, or
Yeah, it's really good. I mean, in some ways, you got me. Yeah. You ever read that Tolkien essay on fairy tales? I think it's called. Is it on fairy stories or fairy tales?
fairy stories.
Yeah, some typically Tolkien, not easy to remember title. You know?
Fairy spelled with the A-E.
Yes, of course. Tolkien, the guy who wrote Lord of the Rings, but in sort of academically, it's his most minor accomplishment. It's kind of weird, you know? But he wrote this essay, and the essay, for all its kind of like old-fashioned nonsense and some of kind of the crazier conjectures, the essay is actually considered like the keystone for understanding genres, especially understanding the fantasy genre. And the one thing that he wrote about was the importance of the secondary world. That why fantasy has so much power is that it tends to create a secondary parallel world to ours with a complete set of rules. Geography, history, yeah? And that's one of the, and for many, many reasons, that's one of the power. I won't go into that. Go read the essay if you want to hear more about it. What you were pointing out, and what I thought was very interesting, is that in fantasy, you have to create a secondary world. If you're writing realistic fiction, you don't have to. People understand that if you come in and drop your pants, or if you come in and spit, that's fucked up, right? But, for example, in the secondary world of a science fiction book like Dune, people spitting means something completely different. And the secondary world has to explain the rules of itself. Yeah? What ends up happening is, if you think about it, when you write about history, history is as inaccessible to the contemporary subjectivity as Middle Earth is. History is a secondary world that has to be created. Most people don't understand what it was like to live under the Trujillato. The same way most people don't understand the difference between orcs and elves. And a secondary world has to be created if you're a historical writer. What's interesting is, if you create a secondary world that's a fantasy world, people think of you as kind of a minor writer. If you create a secondary world that's historical, people are like, you're so dope. Even though it's exactly the same praxis, it's just one praxis is permitted into the country without a passport and the other one is not. Yeah. The third step is the secondary world that dictatorships create inside their own world. I mean, the thing about dictatorships is that you have to create a world where it's completely normal for people to be fucking disappeared and you not to say shit about it. That requires a brand new world and a brand new set of epistemologies and ontologies. Yeah? And dictatorships are really, really good at creating secondary worlds. Speak to any Argentino who lived through the terror, and they will discuss the tenor of life changing, how the secondary world began to have power where before it never existed. And so there's the secondary world of the dictatorship, yeah? History, dictatorship, fantasy. What was interesting for me was that all of these secondary worlds in some ways require similar strategies to create. And there wasn't just science fiction and fantasy being mentioned because it was cute. It's because in some ways I was making arguments about the way secondary worlds function, and sort of a sinister argument, the reverse of what Tolkien argues in his essay, that secondary worlds function so well and so compellingly, not because the writer is so dope that you're a Tolkien, or because the dictator is so incredibly coherent. It's because there's something in our makeup that desires secondary worlds. That there's something very sinister about our desire for secondary worlds that dictatorships have always played on. And one of the great things about secondary worlds is how secondary worlds can enchant things. You know, if you create a secondary world that's like Narnia, like Middle Earth, it can return, they say it can re-enchant the world. It can return to you the sense of wonder that most of us lost as children. The evil side of it is that you can create an inferno like the Dominican Republic during the Trujillato. And people can exist in that secondary world in really, really fucking bizarre ways. And I felt that this book, Oscar's obsession with secondary worlds, I thought dovetailed really nicely with that sort of discussion of the way that dictators in some ways take up the roles of like world builders. Tolkien and Trujillo have a lot more in common than I think people would like to think. And our love for those kind of stories that involve secondary worlds, have a lot more to do with our ability to live inside of the secondary world of dictatorships than we would like to claim. Large claims that we don't have time to really get through, but I felt that those were some of the things that the book was trying to get to and trying to think about. And then, of course, most people don't understand what the hell the Trujillato was, but they understand what Sauron is. And so using Sauron just sort of as an equivalent scale helped to make the leap to across time easier. Does that make any sense at all? Does that seem crazy? Say again, madame?
It made sense to me, yeah.
Are you embarrassed because it made sense to you? No, I'm curious.
Well, you know, did read that essay 15 years old, I think.
Yeah, this is the problem, you guys. When you're a writer, the amount of intellectual work it takes you to create these things has nothing to do with what people read on the page. You know? The problem with art is it requires an enormous intellectual effort. And then, of course, when people consume it or engage with it, all that is lost, which is dope. We'll just take a few more questions and I'll finish reading, yeah? So, madame, sir, and then right behind, all the way behind you. First, here.
Why do you write if it's so hard for you and you're so dubious about it?
Well, I mean, come on. It's like, think about it. Maybe you're blessed and your relationship to the world is like easy. But no, I'm saying for most of us, doubt and hardship are the baselines of existence. I mean, really. Even though we find beauty and peace and companionship and community despite these forces, most of us are much more accustomed to doubt and hardship. And so for me, it's nothing new. You know, it feels very human. What I think is inhuman is people who have an unquestioning relationship to things. The writers who write every day and are just like, you dope. I'm like, you fucking scared the shit out of me. Not just because whatever, some jealousy of production, but because that relationship is not the human one. I've always felt what marks humans is their ability to doubt and the fact that there is no guidebook of why we're here or if we're doing the right damn thing. So it just feels organic. Is that, I'm sorry. Guys, I'm so sorry. I'm like totally ridiculous. There was two more hands straight back, sir, and then all the way back.
So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you developed your fantastic, radical, critical politics, and what its relationship was to your family and to growing up in Jersey, and how you maintained these terrible moments in history.
Oh my God. Yeah, well, most of my friends would be like, that motherfucker ain't radical. I mean, it's amazing. You know? You guys, it doesn't matter that I grew up like almost my entire life, Section 8 with food stamps, and like hungry. Now that I work at MIT, people are like, pfft, that motherfucker ain't street. So I think that these questions sort of, we've got to take them with a kind of a continual, yeah? I always think if you're not your family's favorite son or favorite child, it can often, but not always, develop in you a passion for justice, yeah? I rarely know the blessed child of any family talking about equality and fairness. I'm sorry, if you're the blessed child of a family, hierarchy and tradition. You know? So part of it, I always think, no, I mean, I'm not just saying it as a joke. You don't want to like, I feel like you don't want to like enshrine these things in some sort of like awesome decisions. Some of this stuff is straight petty. I always wondered if I had been my family's absolute favorite son, would I care about any of this stuff? But the other thing is grow up poor and get bussed into an affluent public high school and watch your mother clean. I mean, I was in Princeton yesterday, and what was crazy was that my mom, what she did for a living was clean the houses of Princeton and Rutgers faculty, you know? And it used to drive me, like, again, part of it was because I was very close to my mother and always, despite how fucking crazy and impossible she was, I had compassion towards her, you know? And I used to think, yo, these motherfuckers are like all talking about, oh, they're all critical minded and talking about class and, yo, you gotta take chances, you gotta question your privilege. And they got my mom on their hands and knees cleaning her fucking toilet. And my mom was like way smarter than them motherfuckers. Way harder working. I always say, show me a fucking Princeton professor who can match my mom ounce for ounce for work. You'll see a very short contest. And that does something to you, I think. If you can sustain it long enough in your personal myth. Most of us don't want to sustain unfairnesses in our personal myth because we think that that makes us bitter, that makes us kind of boring, kind of tedious. And also because it hurts, dude. Who the fuck wants to keep that image in your mind? Your mom on her hands and knees, and then later she comes home and reads you the names of the books on the people's shelves because she wrote them down because she knows you're interested in books. And all of them are about workers' rights and all this fucking crazy shit. And you're like, you're grating your teeth that the dentition is snapping off. It's hard. Why would you want to do that? What I discovered is that some people can run marathons, and some of you run marathons, anybody? Damn, you guys look so healthy. One of my best friends, his name's Victor Diaz, no relationship, he runs marathons. Like, he runs them all the time. And one of the things he says is he knows how close he can bring his heart before it dies. He says that if he pushes his heart any further, he knows he'll die. But he has a great ability to endure that kind of colossal agony. And I'm one of those people who seems to have a great capacity to not stop being funny and love life, but still remember that, like, people are fucked up and mean. And so I always wonder, again, if those, I mean, I don't know if those simple answers begin to approach what we're talking about. But when I think about what made me start thinking about some of the issues of justice and fairness, it had to do with simple things like the way that families, despite saying, we love you all equally, it was obvious they didn't. And, you know, again, people who are all like the Marxist chair of labor studies at Princeton, and they like never give your mom a tip for Christmas and hold out on her pay for months. That shit'll, you got some choices. You can pretend it never happened and join the World Bank. You can take it too hard and become an embittered, crazy motherfucker. Yeah, because if you take it too hard, you're gonna stop being fun. Who the fuck wants to dance with somebody who's always sitting around being like Batman, being like, yeah, I'm gonna get them. You know? I mean, that's fucking crazy. But there's a way to integrate the bad things that happen without us being inhuman and without us being jerks. Because the problem with integrating bad things is that you can integrate them in a way that stop making you human. That make you exactly like the people you're trying to avoid. You're trying to, like, you know, the danger of Batman. You know? And now there was one last question in the back, and then I'll read and we'll call it a day.
I'm going to sort of piggyback kind of off the last one, but first of all, who would you cite, I suppose, is your more well-liked authors, and especially in terms of influence? And would you say that you've gotten most of your narrative influence from these authors, or did it just come more from the way experiencing history that happens, the way it kind of just makes you think and makes you experience life that really helps you put down what you have to say?
No, it's a really good question. Again, living sort of biculturally or triculturally, yeah, or whatever the hell you want to call it, it makes for an interesting case study in sort of narratives to begin with. The way that my mother and my father thought about narrative and causality was very distinct from the way, like, my teachers and the Americans that I went to school with thought about it. My mom thought it was absolutely okay to describe that we left Santo Domingo for the United States And you would say, why? And she would be like, it's none of your business. Like, my mom thought that was completely normal narrative strategy, like silence, you know? And in the US, of course, when I was at school, I wasn't taught that that was a normal narrative strategy. Like, you know, that wasn't permissible. And so, A, that there was some of this kind of experiential comparisons, yeah? And B, when it comes to reading and influences, I read tremendously. Like I said, I'm one of those people, if you know when they say you go to a desert island, can you take one book? What book would it be? You know, you probably never heard that shit. With me, I'm always like, if you went to a desert island and you were given the choice between reading or writing, I'm like, reading. I just love to fucking read. So I read everything. I feel like the influencers come from a lot of people, but I would name a Puerto Rican memoirist. His name was Edward Rivera, wrote a book called Family Installments, had an enormous impact on me. For me, in some ways, I'm still trying to get as good as Edward Rivera. I mean, if you're bored enough to read my first book and read Family Installments, you'll see that I basically looted my man like hand and foot. Yeah? Because he was a genius and unrecognized and never valued the way he should have been. And his strategies, he was so far ahead. I mean, honestly, people are like, oh, they'll say, oh, your book is kind of advanced. I'm like, my shit is trying to catch up with somebody who published a book in 1980. I love, again, these two Mexican brothers, the Chicano brothers, who taught me more about how to write than, like, I think, write the kind of stories. The brothers Hernandez, they write that comic book, Love and Rockets. You know, they've been writing this comic book from 1981. They're two Chicano brothers from Oxnard, California. They're writing this comic book about Chicanos in Oxnard and across the border called Love and Rockets. It's one of the most colossal pieces of Latino literature ever written. And when everybody else's stories were about, my mother's a maid, or I'm a drug dealer, you know, or we immigrated with 2 cents and now I run Goya. These guys were writing, like, for real, they were writing these total non-cliche stories about going to the prom, about Battle of the Bands, about being a Chicano rockero, and the everyday details were numinous and perfect. Caribbean writers like Patrick Chamoiseau, who wrote, I think, probably one of the most important novels ever. It's called Texaco. Yeah, I mean, Texaco is unstoppable. I'm one of those people who thinks Salman Rushdie and Midnight's Children, it's one of the greatest novels. Of course, Toni Morrison. Even though I think Toni Morrison's way too brilliant to have any effect on me, I claim her the way you claim that billionaire 15th cousin. I'm like, yeah, she had an influence on me. You know? Definitely a lot of comic books. I mean, I'm one of those people, if you grow up kind of reading in the 80s, the end of the world was a big deal. Because the Americans and the Russians were like, prepare everybody to die. And that was literally the news every day. As a kid, you were just like, what? You know? And societies didn't have ways to address this madness. You know, I was saying, like, my mom thinks it's okay to describe our transition from one country to the next with nothing. I lived in the United States in the 80s when 2 countries were threatening each other with millions of atomic warheads. But there was no place to really talk about how crazy that was. You were a fucking communist if you were like, that's a bad idea, you know? Or you were a class enemy or a traitor if you thought that. And so as a kid, the only place where you found those anxieties expressed and dealt with and confronted and mediated was in, like, really bad movies and comic books. I mean, watch Planet of the Apes and you'll get an understanding what being 13 in 1981 was like. I'm not kidding, man. Or watch the original Omega Man, yeah? I mean, this shit, again, every day I would deliver my newspaper, which was a really big mistake. I think I had not been a newspaper boy, I wouldn't have noticed that every day they would say, 10,000 more warheads added to the pile. So there was also those influences, yeah? So I'm just gonna read a small thing, and we're going to call it a day. All right? Guys, this is just from the opening of the book. Yeah? This is sort of the opening incantation in some way. There's this crazy thing in Santo Domingo. In Puerto Rico, they call it fufu. Yeah, what's that, Professor? No, but don't look at me. Tell them. What is a fufu? No, English. English, Professor.
A malediction, a malefication,
A curse.
a curse.
Yeah. Any Colombian? That.
Curse that you could get. Someone puts it on you and your family and the whole, for generations you could go with a fufu.
Yeah.
Everything that's bad, it's because of a fufu.
Yeah. And any Colombians here, like from Colombia? Yeah. What's up? You've heard the word fuku, right? Really? No, I believe you. Yeah, I just came back from Colombia. I was in Bogota, and every single football game, like soccer game, when somebody would miss a pass or would do something, they'd be like, "Diablo, ese fuku lo pegó." You know? In Colombia, it's more of just an act of bad luck. Yeah? And see? They're like, they're not Colombians. Okay, in Bogota. Yeah. And so this opening is just about this curse that originates in the Caribbean, which the family, the main characters of our novel, may or may not be living under. And I'll just read that. It's only a page, and then we'll call it a day. The narrative is being explained first that in the Dominican Republic, the fuku, this kind of viral bad luck, is believed to have originated with Christopher Columbus. Now, nobody ever actually elaborates it, because if you say Christopher Columbus' name in Santo Domingo, it means you immediately get the bad luck cooties. And if you accidentally say his name for some strange reason, you have to say the word Safa, which breaks the bad luck right there. Just a weird thing. But it's hilarious. The island that he first discovered, people won't even say his name, because they're convinced then terrible things will happen. And so that's the opening, and this is the rest of it, and we'll call it a day. But the fuku ain't just ancient history, a ghost story from the past with no power to scare. In my parents' day, the fuku was real as shit, something your everyday person could believe in. Everybody knew someone who had been eaten by a fuku, just like everybody knew somebody who worked up in the palacio. It was in the air, you could say, though like all the most important things on the island, not something folks really talked about. But in those elder days, fuku had it good. It had a hype man of sorts, a high priest, you could say, our then dictator for life, Rafael Trujillo. No one knows whether Trujillo was the curse's servant or its master, its agent or its principal, but it was clear he and it had an understanding, that the two of them was tight. It was believed even in educated circles that anyone who plotted against Trujillo would incur a fuku most powerful down to the 7th generation and beyond, which explains why everybody who tried to assassinate Trujillo always got done, why those dudes who finally did buck him down all died so horrifically. And what about fucking Kennedy? He was the one who greenlighted the assassination of Trujillo in 1961, who ordered the CIA to deliver arms to the island. Bad move, Captain. For what Kennedy's intelligence experts failed to tell him was what every single Dominican from the richest Habao in Mao to the poorest way in El Buey knew, that whoever killed Trujillo, their family would suffer a fuku so dreadful, it would make the one that attached itself to the Admiral Jojote in comparison. You want a final conclusive answer to the Warren Commission question, who killed John F. Kennedy? Let me, your humble watcher, reveal once and for all the God's honest truth. It wasn't the mob or LBJ or the ghost of Marilyn fucking Monroe. It wasn't aliens or the KGB or the lone gunman. It wasn't the Hunts brothers of Texas or Lee Harvey Oswald. It was Trujillo. It was the fuku. Where in Coñazo do you think the curse of the Kennedys comes from? And what about Vietnam? Why do you think the greatest power in the world lost its first war to a pissant third world country like Vietnam? I mean, Negro, please. It might interest you to know that just as the United States was ramping up its involvement in Vietnam, Lyndon B. Johnson launched an illegal invasion of the Dominican Republic. Santo Domingo was Iraq before Iraq was Iraq. A smashing military success for the U.S., and many of the same units and intelligence teams that took part in the democratization of Santo Domingo were immediately shipped off to Saigon. And what do you think these soldiers, technicians, and spooks carried with them in their rucksacks, in their suitcases, in their shirt pockets, on the hair inside their nostrils, and caked up around their shoes? Just a little gift from my people to America, a small repayment for an unjust war. That's right, Fuku. Which is why it's important to remember Fuku doesn't always strike like lightning. Sometimes it's patient, sometimes it works patiently, drowning a nigger by degrees, like with the Admiral or the US and the Paddies outside of Saigon. Sometimes Fuku is slow, and sometimes it is fast. It is doomish that way. Makes it harder for you to put a finger on, to brace yourself against. But be assured, like Darkseid's Omega effect, like Morgoth's Bane, no matter how many turns and digressions this shit might take, it always, and I mean always, gets its man. Thank you. Have a good night, you guys.
Anyone interested? Junot Díaz will be outside signing books. Thank you.